Good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be here at SVOD. My name is Burton Lee. Technically, I'm actually a lecturer. Only certain people are allowed to call themselves professors or consulting professors at Stanford. And it's a great honor to be invited to moderate this panel this afternoon. And as Anna's mentioned, the title of this panel is Building Bridges Across Seas and Continents. So we have today some very distinguished speakers representing a number of the up-and-coming, very interesting hot tech hotspots around the world in innovation, in entrepreneurship, in investment, in startups, out of Israel, out of Sweden, and I'll introduce everybody individually, out of Russia, out of Ireland, and out of China. We're going to spend 5 minutes. Basically, everyone's going to give a quick overview of kind of the hot topics, what's going on in their country or region. Then we're going to open it up for a general discussion about broad trends across the ecosystem, particular issues that have come up in recent weeks or months that I think are of broad interest to each of these countries. And we're also going to open it up for some Q&A. Before I go to intros, just to follow up on Anna's brief introduction, I lecture at Stanford in the engineering school on European entrepreneurship and innovation each January through March. We do an online series now. We're also putting up a new YouTube video channel in the next few weeks with some of our recent lectures. We invite you to attend our lectures January through March. They're open to the public Monday afternoons at 4:15. Again, this is in the engineering school. We're entering our 6th year, this coming January. We began in 2009, and we feature leading entrepreneurs and investors from Iceland to Russia and from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean region. So it's a very good place to network and find out what's happening broadly across the European startup and venture capital scene. So just brief introductions from the Israeli consulate here in San Francisco is Sigal Admoni Ravid, Counselor for Economic Affairs. Ann Lidgard is Director of Vinnova, the Swedish innovation agency based at Stanford University, and a colleague of mine. We have Dmitry Chikachev, pardon me if I didn't pronounce that totally correctly, partner at Runa Capital, being our Russian representative today. Deirdre Moran of IIDA, or the Invest in Ireland agency out of Dublin, also based here in the Valley. And then Jack Leah of GSR Ventures, representing also the which association, Jack? High-Start Association, who's here to talk about what's happening in China. Let's kick off with Ann and just run down the panel. Again, quick 5-minute kind of summary, and then we'll go into general Q&A and discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Burton. So yes, my name is Ann Lidgard. I work for the Swedish Innovation Agency. Basically, we're here because we really feel that if we want to be an innovation agency of world class, we need to be connected to one of the most innovative hubs in the world, which is, of course, Silicon Valley. Now, many of you know about the Nordic region. We're 5 individual countries: Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland. In my 5 minutes now, I think I'll try to just briefly touch upon some of the questions related to VCs and startups. And I hope that some of you probably know the Nordics as it's generally perceived as a stable region with modern welfare societies, all that, harsh, sometimes cold winters, but that's just, they pass and we get into summer. But I also hope that many of you also associate the Nordic countries as really a hotspot for European startups and VC activity. I'm sure you recognize some of the brands such as Rovio, King, Skype, Spotify, etc. Those are just a few of them. There are also quite interesting statistics that really show how really hot this is on a European base. I mean, if you look at for some of the top European countries for VC investments in terms of percentage of GDP, the Nordics are all there in the top 10. In 2012, Sweden actually led in 3rd place after the UK and Luxembourg. And also if you look at VC fundraising, the Nordics raised 17.5% share of the total of European VC fundraising. That's compared to 3.5%, which is the population of the Nordic region. So proportionally high percentage of activity compared to the rest of Europe. And just to give you a few other numbers, I mean, the average exit value for the past 12 years has been 2 billion euro. And again, Skype, ClickTech, MySQL are just a few of those brands that you may be recognizing. So it is a great region for VC investments. And if we look at from 1996 until 2010, it was actually 33% of Europe's billion US dollar exits came from the Nordic region. Many of these companies, of course, pass through Silicon Valley as well, but I think it's good to know that if you really don't want to miss out on some of the other good stuff, if you are a VC, you really need to be present also in the Nordic region or be closely associated to local VCs. I'd also just briefly like to mention a few recent happenings. Creandum, which is one of the larger VCs back in Sweden, they actually just recently closed now their third fund, which is quite an exploit. They were early investors, by the way, in Spotify, Vivino, Rap, iSettled, etc. So they just closed a $177 million US dollar fund, and so we're really looking forward to some really, really interesting deals now in the years to come from their part. I'd also like to just mention on the other side of other kind of investments, Facebook chose the northern Sweden as one of their sites for one of their major data centers, which of course being in the north of Sweden is also totally carbon neutral, and it made them get on the like list of Greenpeace again. So that was, and now that whole region is really seeing how can we further develop technology and knowledge. So summarize, Nordic region, hotspots when it comes to startups, very much technology oriented thanks to our tradition in telecom and mobile telephony, but also in health tech and clean tech, of course. So that's a brief summary.
Great, thank you, Anne. I think one of the things which makes the Nordic region actually very exciting is Russia is just beginning to come online, also as a part of the Baltic, although not traditionally part of the Baltic political alliance. But the Nordic region really is one of Europe's major hotspots across numerous cities. Now we're going to jump from the Baltic region, Nordic, down to the Mediterranean. And Siegel, tell us what's going on in Israel, some of the highlights.
Well, Israel is considered to be somewhat of a small Silicon Valley, and of course, us being here is vital. And I'm very glad to be here, part of it. By the way, thank you for inviting me. I can tell you about what's going on in Israel in terms of startups. First of all, just to give you an estimate of what's going on there. Where Israel is about 8 million people, we are the size of more or less New Jersey. People like to compare us to New Jersey. So in terms of per capita investments that are pouring into Israel, when I'm thinking of mergers and acquisitions that even took place last year, for instance, we're about $8 billion in M&As. And the funds that are pouring into Israel in terms of both M&As and investments, if we're to look at it per capita, we're supposed to be about 25 times as much as the funds per capita pouring into Europe, and about 2.5 times as much the funds per capita that are pouring into the United States. If we're thinking of IPOs that are taking part in the NASDAQ, so there are more Israeli companies in the NASDAQ than any other country in the world, besides the United States, and I think now Canada as well. And the way that we do it is, first and foremost, this micro environment of startup companies that are in Israel is very strong. We have about 6,000 and counting in Israel. About more than 500 startups are getting into these 6,000 each year. A lot of them, of course, are closing, but there is a very strong scene of startups in Israel. And the scene there is very much located and attributed to what's going on here in the United States, especially in Silicon Valley. And you can see ideas coming out and pouring in, from Israel to Silicon Valley, to New York, and to other hubs around the world. If I can talk about specific, just a couple of examples. So the last one, I guess that part of the might have heard about it yesterday. Waze, which is an Israeli social mapping company, was acquired by Google for more than $1 billion. And that goes along with other companies, Anobit that was acquired by Apple last year, NDS by Cisco, Radvision by Araya, and many, many others. This is a very strong part of what we do in Israel. If I'm thinking of trends, we are very much dependent upon trends that are going on in the entire world. As we are a very small country and we're very much dependent on export, about 45% of what we produce in Israel is going to export. So we are very volatile and we're very much dependent on what's going on outside of Israel. So the trends are very much similar to what's going on here in the United States. If I'm thinking of the VC community, for instance. So you can see somewhat of a shrinkage in the VC community in Israel. Most of the strong VCs or the large ones are still there, but you can see the smallest VCs now tagging along and even disappearing. We are restabling, let's say, that whole environment of funding in Israel. You can see more going into equity, which was not there at all. If you were looking at like 3, 4, 5 years ago, there wasn't really these kind of companies there. Private equity was not really there. Today you can see more and more of these Israeli companies. A lot of times people are coming to me, and one of the criticism that Israel is receiving is that a lot of it is about startup nation and a lot of startups, but what about the large companies that needs to be built there? And the interesting thing is that now I more and more hear about companies from Israel wanting to be the next large IPO coming out of Israel. And at the seed stages, somewhat this is becoming more and more of an aspiration for Israeli companies as well, where of course there is yet to be seen if this is going to be a new way for the Israeli companies, but it's definitely something that you can see it's starting to be interesting for Israeli companies as well. It's not only the little startups that want to be acquired at the 10, 20, 30 million dollars. You can see more of them wanting to go as big as possible, and I think that Waze that was acquired yesterday is a very good example of that.
So Siegel, just to recount those numbers, about 6,000 startups in Israel today.
More. But this is the
500 new startups a year are being created, so that's approximately 10% growth. Mm-hmm. Those are huge numbers for any ecosystem. I don't think Europe certainly doesn't produce 10% growth in numbers of new companies, new startups each year. I don't know if the US does either, or the Valley. Mm-hmm. China might come close to that number. We don't know those numbers, but anyway, that's worth highlighting. Jack, tell us about China.
Thank you. I think as far as probably could go from the European countries and the tech communities. How many people are familiar with the China tech world here in the audience? Oh, only 2 people, so pretty much I can say anything. So I'm Jack Jia, by the way, and been a sort of a serial entrepreneur. Did 4 companies myself, and 2 of them are actually affiliated with China. And then GSR Venture is a fund that started about 7, 8 years ago, focused on exclusively on China. So we have about $1.2 billion under management. It was actually incubated by Mayfield, so it's kind of Mayfield China originally. If you look at the China sort of tech development, really I think every 10 years there's a major trend shifting. Right? In the 90s, and including my own company, was largely taking what's working, end-to-end product and just move it to China. I took Micron Computer to China, and many other technology companies just went in and sold their products. And there was very little innovation in the 90s. In 2000, probably from the dot-com days, 2000 to 2010, and that 10 years really kind of started the whole China tech development. And in GSR Venture did a lot of early stage investment. And the thesis was really sort of taking this time machine concept, right? Taking what's working, which concept made a $1 billion company in the US, and then do that in China. And so the sort of the biggest time gap in terms of time machine is actually we invest this company called Dazhihui, it was big intelligence. Basically, it's a Bloomberg of China. There was probably 10, 15 years of time gap when Bloomberg was started versus the Chinese version of the Bloomberg. And then later on, we did, this company called Qunar, which is Kayak of China. We did a Craigslist of China, Match.com China, Groupon China. So we have about 70 some investment, half of that internet software focused 30, 40 company, and largely taking that same concept and apply that. And the most recently, last week, we had one company went public on New York Stock Exchange called Light in the Box, which is really a unique way of doing Amazon, taking sort of online as a platform, sell Chinese products overseas. And they don't actually sell, the one market they don't sell is China. And they sell every other countries, and it's actually a Stanford grad, a Chinese native, and went back to Beijing and started this company. So there's a lot of concept like that that's been working out really well in the last 10 years. And so a lot of companies got formed. I think from an investment perspective, there has been a China freeze for the last probably a year and a half, because there were some accounting scandals and about a year and a half ago with a lot of Chinese companies, and everybody got scared. And it just started to open up. I think there were only two companies went IPO last year from China on NASDAQ, and they both did really well. And this year, Light in the Box is one of the first one, and there's actually a whole 24 company that's all lined up to go IPO. And so it looks like that whole trend is reversing. Now, if you look at forward, so where is the hot sort of area that going forward in the next 10 years? And if you look deeper, and it's actually a very unique phenomenon that's between US and China, and maybe China and the European countries. If you look at the GDP growth, China continued to have this amazing growth, somewhere in the 7-8%, right? It used to be 10%. And US has been very low, 1 or 2% or even 0. So that really drives a lot of international companies continue to do well in China, especially if you got a great brand, right? The European brands are doing extremely well in China. Doesn't matter, started with the luxury goods and the automobiles, then tech products now. And the Chinese are probably notoriously pursuing brands, and they're willing to pay in the local currency. Local price would be probably 5 times more. The BMW car in the US is what, $80,000? In China is $250,000 to $300,000, and then people are buying them, and that's applying for every kind of brand products, and so that really continue to drive a lot of the growth and tech company growth. And I know Evernote has a big presence in China, is really pushing hard. The reverse sort of a cross-border opportunity is also become obvious. If you don't look at the GDP growth, if you look at per capita GDP. And China's actually still very low. It's only $5,000. US is what, $50,000? So it creates a huge gap. If you are a company doing well in China, right? There's a lot of native Chinese companies doing well. The next growth phase really is overseas, right? Because if you can make money with $5,000 per capita income, you will make a lot more money with $50,000 in other markets, as long as you understand the culture and all the nuances by going overseas. And so, probably the leading company is this company called Tencent. I don't know how many people have heard Tencent. Okay, so a few. And they have a product called WeChat, for example. It's just absolutely amazing growth from basically a brand new product 2.5 years ago to about 400 million, half billion users today, right? And they're trying to go overseas, and it is one of the unique social products that's kind of combined a lot of good things about everything, and no one. They actually cracked the code, but now whether they can crack the code of really taking that overseas and be a global player, that's going to be interesting to watch. So that's kind of the next 10 years.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Back to Europe and Ireland. Deidre.
Thank you. So my name is Deirdre, and I work with IIDA Ireland. IIDA Ireland is effectively an Irish government agency that works with international companies, promoting Ireland as the premier business location in Europe for companies who are looking to access that market. I suppose it began back in the day. Ireland is a small country, 4.5 million people, small domestic market similar to Israel, well, half the size. So to be a successful economy, a company within Ireland, you needed to, I suppose, export. So back in the 60s, we were predominantly an agricultural-focused country, and took some policy decisions which have been really, really successful. We brought in a low-tax policy to, I suppose, attract inward investment. There was large unemployment back in the day, so there was access to a well-educated, cheap workforce. And this has paid off. So we focused on life sciences and technology predominantly, and today we've become the second largest exporter of software in the world. We're the second largest exporters of medical devices in Europe, and also the largest net exporter of pharmaceuticals in the world as well. So we've done very, very well as a country, and we continually try to, I suppose, change our policy and make sure that it is conducive to inward investors. If you drive up and down the 101, like just in the Bay Area alone, companies like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, all have European, and these are European operations. They're not there for the domestic market. They are supporting, they're supporting and selling to Europe from Ireland. I suppose about 3 years ago, we set up a team that I'm part of that works with startups. We wanted to leverage the existing clusters in life sciences and in technology, and to attract the next wave of these companies, and that again has paid off. So companies like Zendesk here from San Francisco, Dropbox, Quantcast, companies like Etsy, Squarespace, HubSpot from the East Coast are all coming to Ireland to build their, I suppose it's their first international or maybe second international step, and using that to effectively globalize their companies and their products. Also, as an agency, we help companies do that. We help them evaluate the proposition. We also help them through the practical implementation of setup. But also we do influence policy. So we are constantly surveying our clients. We have about 1,200 client companies, predominantly from the US, but 80% of our business comes from the US. And we are feed into government policy around immigration, around fiscal policy, and also just around, I suppose, bureaucracy, and making sure that it's very easy to set up a company and to get what you need done across Europe. We also have a sister agency called Enterprise Ireland, who have one of the largest VC funds in Europe. Their role is to build the local ecosystem and work with Irish entrepreneurs to help them build businesses and build successful businesses. We work closely with them to help build partnerships with US companies out here. The third, I suppose, key economic development agency in Ireland would be Science Foundation Ireland, which is the equivalent of the NSF here, and they are focusing on funding research and researchers all around the world to carry out, I suppose, the most leading edge research with universities in Ireland, but also encouraging them to partner with universities across Europe and also in the US.
Deirdre, thank you. Moving from Ireland to Russia. Russia's probably the major new emerging player on the European tech scene. Dimitri, can you give us an overview of what's happening?
Yeah, to start the overview, let us look backwards to the history of Russia. Actually, Russia is one of the few countries which can witness the century of history in innovation. So many things, many objects were created by Russians, invented by Russians, that made a deep impact in like history of the total world. Like if we mention a few things that were invented by graduates of Russian universities, it's like helicopter. Igor Sikorsky graduated from Kiev. It's not exactly Russia now, but still a former Soviet Union country. And then television, invented by Vladimir Zworykin, graduated from St. Petersburg University, and gas mask, invented by Nikolai Zelensky, and then later Sputnik and nuclear reactor and laser. So a lot of things that were invented by Russians that made really big impact on the mankind. And that's because Russia is not only famous for its huge territory and natural resources, but Russia is also famous for its high-quality engineering education. And so one of good things that did communist government was that they invested a lot into education system. And most of Russian universities are still in a very good shape, and they produce, only in IT we have 34,000 graduates per year. To compare with China, I think in China the number is 94,000 per year, more or less. But relative to country size, you can see the impact. And Russia enjoys market economy for 20 years, and even less of civilized market economy, maybe 10 years. But if you look at recent developments in software space, it's only a few countries can say that products developed by engineers are competitive in global market. To mention few that have Russian origin is Evernote. We've seen Phil living here, but the company was founded and R&D is still based in Russia. We have Parallels. Many people who use Mac know this software developed by Russian engineers. We have Badu. This is the leading dating site globally, Andrei Andreev. And then Cut the Rope, the game that replaced Angry Birds as in the top charts. Cut the Rope, it's developed by Russian guys. So you can see that just over 10 years, a lot of things appeared from nowhere, actually. And we basically started from ground zero when Soviet Union collapsed. And if we look at Russian IT exports, recent developments, in 2002, Russian IT exports were $300 million US. In 2010, Russian IT exports grew tenfold to $3 billion US. And same stands for investment in domestic R&D. So domestic R&D doubled from 9 billion to 18 billion. If we look at venture capital deals, last year, 2012, we had 910 venture capital funded deals in Russia. But just 3 years ago, in 2009, it was 154 deals. And back in 2007, it was 18 deals, 18. So you can see the kind of the dynamics. And when we started raising Runa Capital 3 years ago here in the Valley, we had no Russian IPOs as yet. Now we have several of them. We have Yandex, we have Mail.ru, we have EPAM, we have Kiwi, the recent one. So you can see that things are changing very rapidly. And another positive trend is that Russian government is actually very supportive towards technological entrepreneurship. So over the last few years, we've seen a number of initiatives supporting the specifically technological entrepreneurship. To mention a few, it's Rosnano, RVK, Russian Venture Capital, it's Skolkovo projects, and a number of smaller foundations that support startups, that give them small grants and small seed money. So things are rapidly changing, and I believe in future we will see more Russian IPOs.
Dmitry, thank you. Jack, you touched on this issue of trust around accounting, which affected investment and performance in China. Many of you who follow the US policy scene, I'm sure heard about the leak last week about the National Security Agency in this country surveilling, monitoring the accounts of major US internet companies. Do any of you have any reactions as to how you think this issue of trust regarding US internet providers, data centers, cloud, how it might advantage Russia, Ireland, China, Israel, or the Nordic countries in terms of future growth of internet-based services, software, et cetera? Is this something that your countries and regions can take advantage of that will be have a real impact?
I can start there. Obviously, Facebook is probably the most, very high-profile European audit around their data protection just over the last 2 years. They actually ran that audit through Ireland. European data protection is a huge issue, and any companies I'm meeting here, in fact, Zendesk, who opened in Ireland an office last year, they announced a $1 million investment in data center in KIT in Ireland because they needed to have to hold their sensitive consumer data in the EU. So in fact, this is actually driving business to Europe, and I think some countries are well placed to leverage that. Where Facebook basically worked with a number of European data protection commissioners across Europe, engaged with the Irish Data Protection Commissioner to actually to run that audit. It was over 18 months of work, looking at how they build out their systems, how they code. The engineers were flown over to the Data Protection Commissioner to really audit that. LinkedIn are going through it now, and in fact, I think it's actually going to help Europe or help position help Europe win business from US companies. It is a huge consideration for internet-based companies at the moment.
Anyone else?
I would say two things about this. First, I have to say that Israel is considered to be a place where the penetration percentage in terms of technology and data and information and everything that has to do with the web and the internet is very, very high. Most Israelis carry 2 cell phones, if not 3, according to the numbers, so just so you understand what we're talking about. So we find an opportunity because many of the data centers now are going into Israel, if I may comment on what you say. For instance, even companies such as Citibanks and others are coming into Israel because they find it as a more attractive environment to have their data centers there. On the other side, we can see a very large opportunity on the cybersecurity side as well. I mean, looking on the other side. I mean, Israel is very known for cybersecurity companies and protection of data and information coming out. The companies are springing out from the army, of course, for the military and everything that they know about it. They're actually implementing in a civilian, some sort of civilian implementations, you can say. And a lot of these cybersecurity companies, especially now with all we see with cybersecurity attacks, are finding a strong opportunity here and are using it very good, I have to say. So with the large companies that are coming out from Israel, you can see many, many more small ones that are working on multi-levels, companies and technologies that can be in touch both with the security codes of the most advanced computers as well as your refrigerator on the same platform. Amazing things. So you see the opportunity here on both sides, I think.
Anne?
And I'd say certainly this goes for the Nordics as well. I mean, when a thing like this happened, I looked at the Twitter feeds and the other social media and newspaper. This is really a very big concern. I mean, at the same time, it's a big opportunity, of course, because the Nordic region always, likes to position itself as a very safe haven from many perspectives. Also, in terms of corruption perception index, I mean, we're always, all the 5 countries are rated among the top 10 countries in the world. Now, at the end of the game, I mean, there are, of course, many factors that play in when companies decide to put their data centers, but certainly Google and Facebook are already there in Finland and Sweden, and we have many, many startups working with cybersecurity issues. We have one company actually that also has a part of the company here, Yubico, working very closely with Google right now. So, I mean, to be continued.
Jack, China also has major issues around trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of, I'm very concerned about the U.S. government sort of pursuing a lot of these private data or audit data, and even a lot of the WikiLeaks sort of incidents that's, and certainly that seems to be following the Chinese government suit. They were notorious for doing that. But if you look actually China in its own context, the whole internet and social media, although there's been a lot of these sort of government hands in a lot of the pots, but on balance, actually, it helped really China to move forward to democracy, to really civil rights, and because the availability of anybody can tweet something or chat something or WeChat something, and that made really government back off on a lot of things and made a lot of things possible. I think if you look at the Chinese government, I mean, a lot of the panelists are government employees, and they actually have the hardest jobs, because if anybody say anything on WeChat or Weibo and their job, they could lose their job very easily. So it's actually the counterbalance that's actually doing a lot good for China right now. And I think the new regime, the new government that just changed hand, is actually more liberal and allowing more of this to happen. So there's actually a lot of positive move, and I hope U.S. government is actually going the other direction rather than backwards.
Dimitri, any comments?
Well, in general, of course, the cybersecurity and protection of information is always a concern, and there are some steps to protect the personal information. So we can now see that internet, which was before one of the least regulated parts of Russian society, is getting more and more regulated. But I think this is very positive, and we need some like soft regulation measures in this space. Otherwise, it will become too easy for crime and any kind of fraud. So that's for personal data. For business data, it's less concerned as yet, because mediums and small business is still using cloud services, not to the extent that would made it a major threat. But I think this will appear in future, because the usage of in cloud services is growing rapidly in small and medium business. So I think at some point this will become a topic for discussion, specifically the physical place where the data is stored, because it may be perceived as a threat to national security when it's the bulk of its business data is stored overseas. You can easily imagine a situation when this data is being used to put a pressure on a country.
So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience for the panel. Who's first? Stas has tracked down a candidate. Please.
So thank you all for coming and present your point of view about your respective countries. Do you feel that your main competition is keeping your local entrepreneurs from going to the US? Do you see yourselves at all as competing with each other?
Are you addressing your question to anyone in particular?
Well, I would think, maybe Ireland is competing for entrepreneurs from all over the world, or maybe they're thinking, how do we get, American companies to come to us? The mindset wasn't that clear to me. And then, Israel could be competing for the Jewish American population, or Scandinavia for expats that went to school here and maybe they're trying to attract to come back, or not leave and go to Silicon Valley.
Anne?
I can comment on that. We certainly look very positively at our entrepreneurs building the companies both in Sweden and in Silicon Valley, because I think the whole idea is to use the complementarity of the two places. It turns out that keeping your R&D team back in Sweden is actually a really good idea, because we have very skilled engineers, very good developers. They are more stable, loyal, whatever. Lots of good factors, they have their families and all that. But Silicon Valley is really important also for the companies. They need to be here because they need to really be in touch of what is the competition, but also the market, and not just the US market, because it's also the gatekeepers for the world market that are here. So what we really try to promote from the Swedish Innovation Agency and from other, is really to, let's make sure that we can really leverage, the best parts of both places. So we're not afraid of having our entrepreneurs come here. I mean, sure, some will choose to stay here because of the lifestyle, but there are many bottlenecks and difficult things about building your company in Silicon Valley right now. So I mean, we're just embracing more and more links between Silicon Valley, because I think it's going to just favor both places.
Yeah, Jack?
I can comment a little bit what's going on in China. And I don't know how many people are familiar with, the private sector competition is very similar to the US, but the government itself is actually organized to compete as well. So each city, each province are really competitor to each other. And in fact, you've seen a lot of the science park development that's really originally just really building sort of science park to draw people in to work in Shanghai or Beijing or somewhere. But now actually they're seeing this phenomena that they actually can come here in Silicon Valley, not just draw talent back, but they actually can establish a presence here. So there's actually, in the last probably year also, there's been more science park built in Silicon Valley, represent a particular region or city of China. There's the InnoSpring, which represents Tsinghua University Science Park, and together with Silicon Valley Bank, actually built this facility that's incubating startups here. They have about 50 startups that's housed in there. And then there's something called Z Park, which is Zhongguancun, which is kind of like the China Silicon Valley in Beijing. And so there's a lot of sort of unique way that they are kind of avoiding their neighbor-to-neighbor competition, because each city, each mayor basically, in fact, in China is a group CEO, they have a quota of GDP quota, right, assigned by the government. So they must meet their quota in order to keep their job. And so they are coming overseas. They're going to Europe a lot. All right, they're really finding, as I mentioned, that the global market is actually a bigger market than they thought they would have to go after.
Dimitri?
Yeah, it's a good question. Are we afraid of Russian entrepreneurs going to the valley? And I think my answer would be we're not, because, as I said, we have good supply of R&D people back home, and moving R&D to Silicon Valley for a Russian startup doesn't make any sense, indeed. Moving your business functions, like your biz dev and sales people, or establishing office in the valley, that makes a lot of sense on the opposite, because US is still the biggest software market. 40% of global market is US, United States, and kind of Silicon Valley is the heart of this market. And for a Russian company who dares going global, who dares kind of challenge the US competition, definitely having local presence here is a must. And again, companies like Evernote or the recent example NGINX, they need to be in the valley. They need to have a business office here, but not R&D. R&D is back home.
Siegel, I'll give you the last word.
Well, first I have a question. How many of you were born in California? Raise your hands. One. Just so you understand. So most, especially here in Silicon Valley, I think that no one is really from here. I mean, we're all coming from somewhere, you know. But it's a very timely question that you ask, because if you were to ask me this question 20 years ago, I would probably say that yes, the government thinks it's horrible that people are coming and living in Israel and not building it with their own hands, etc. But today we find that there are great attributes to doing that. I mean, not only that Israel is a very small market and we need to go outside in order to bring more capital and to increase and enlarge our companies and to create, you know, multinational companies. But apart from that, I mean, eventually a large portion of the population that is coming, and you can see it in a lot of high places in very large companies. They have, and they are learning and they are experiencing in things that they cannot do in Israel, and afterwards they are bringing all of this knowledge back to Israel, and that is, I think, that the most important attributes from all of it. It's more than just the funds. It's more just having important people in important places that are making important decisions on a daily basis, and today it's the economy that drives the entire world. But apart from that, it's actually getting all this knowledge back to Israel and making us that way stronger and more capable of building our own companies there. So I think it's important.
Thank you. So I think it's clear that Silicon Valley continues to play.
If I just may, and by the way, Adi from Owners Listen, I really hope that you will be one of them and you will return to Israel and a lot of knowledge.
Thank you. It's clear that Silicon Valley continues to play a very important role in helping accelerate the growth of companies internationally in all of your countries and regions. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for participating. I'd like to invite the participants to meet the panelists. We're moving on to our final part of the conference. Anna, thank you very much.